Brendan Cahill. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs at Fordham University, and it's my pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here to this, our most recent webinar on humanitarian issues. It's wonderful to see old friends through this Zoom and to keep our humanitarian community together. The Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs was founded to act as a bridge between the humanitarian and academic communities, and it does so through training programs. We offer undergraduate majors and minors, as well as graduate programs. We have a Master of Science in Humanitarian Studies and a Master of International Humanitarian Action. In addition, we manage our own press, the Refuge Press, and we have, there will be 6 books out this year, as well as a gallery here in the Bronx, the Refuge Gallery, lecture series, online webinars, and whenever we return back to normal, in-person conferences as well. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we will be recording this and it will be available on our YouTube channel, the address of which Camille will share with everyone at the end of this call. I'm thrilled to welcome Rick Fernandez today. This is our 3rd Zoom webinar. Future ones will be James Shepard Barron on the calamity of the calculus of calamity, which will be on the 29th, and Lex Tackenberg on humanitarian sector and corruption on the 6th of October. I'm thrilled to have this speaker series. Again, it's an opportunity for us to be together, to ask these questions, and to look at these themes as one, even though we might be all over the world. I would ask that you put your questions into the host, so either into Camille, and I will go through them. Today's program will be after my introduction of Rick. Rick will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions, final remarks, and we'll be on our way. I'd ask that you remain muted throughout. Rick Fernandez is an independent social impact and urban humanitarian operations consultant who helps organizations develop plans and partnerships to maximize social impact and then communicate that impact to their stakeholders. He currently serves as the Executive Director of Innovation and of the Innovation and Planning Agency USA, IPA USA, which focuses on leveraging entrepreneurship and innovation to meet humanitarian and development challenges. Previously, he served as both a program development officer and as an international protection officer with Nonviolent Peace Force in South Sudan, worked as a program manager with IBM's Corporate Services Core program, scouted social enterprises in Nairobi, developed emergency plans at the New York City Department of Emergency Management, and helped manage foreign police assistance programs at the US Department of Justice. He has a diploma in monitoring and evaluation from NYU School of Professional Studies, a certificate in social enterprise management and impact investing from the Monterey Institute of International Studies, an international diploma in humanitarian assistance from Fordham University, and this is where I met Rick many years ago, an MIA from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and a BA from NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. Rick will be teaching for the Institute in the spring. That information will be ready by the end of this week. It will be the course on urban humanitarian operations. Rick's title for this webinar is From Camps to Streets, Adapting Humanitarian Operations for Urban Areas. And I turn it over to Rick. Thank you, Rick.
Let me just share my screen. Okay, well, Brendan, thank you so much for that introduction. Special thanks to Camille for helping me get all of this organized. And of course, thanks to all of you for allowing me to share what I've learned both as a urban emergency / disaster manager in the city of New York, and also a protection officer working in the protection of civilian site in Bentiu, South Sudan. We're going to be speaking about a couple different things today. We're going to be speaking about why, if you're a humanitarian, urban areas should matter to you. We're going to be discussing my working definition of what urban humanitarian operations are. We're going to be looking at the built environment as well as how people receive food in both camp settings and urban areas. And hopefully that will shed some light on why traditional humanitarian operations need to be adapted for urban areas. There will be 2 case studies that will hopefully be representative of those points. The first case study, the camp of Zatari, and the second case study, the Shore Soup project that was started following Superstorm Sandy. Towards the end of our discussion, we'll look at how humanitarians can adapt their operations to working in urban areas. We'll talk about both an attitudinal change and also specific operational models, and then we'll close with questions. So, why you should care about urban areas if you're a humanitarian. If you look at the chart on your screen, you'll see that red line. That red line is the trend line, is the forecast of urbanization in less developed regions. All experienced emergency managers, all experienced humanitarians know that less developed regions are normally less resilient. So if the less resilient areas of the world are urbanizing quickly, that's where the humanitarian work is going to be done. So that trend line runs all the way to 2050. So between now and 2050, and most likely beyond, most of humanitarian work will probably trend towards working in urban areas. Okay. Well, if we're going to be working in urban areas, then we need a definition of what urban humanitarian operations are. And I'd like to offer one. Well, what I mean by urban humanitarian operations, I mean all of the activities within the conflict and disaster cycle conducted by people who try to prevent and alleviate suffering arising from conflict or disaster. Now, who do I mean by those people? Well, of course, I mean the UN agencies and international NGOs that operate in the international system. I also mean the national and subnational societies of the International Red Cross. I mean the organizations that work regionally and nationally and sometimes subnationally that are also part of the international system. I mean the non-governmental organizations that work at the national and subnational levels that aren't necessarily disaster specific, but certainly have a role when disaster strikes. And last but certainly not least, I mean everyday citizens who work to help their neighbor when a crisis occurs. Now the last part, in cities or in urban areas, might seem to be the simplest part of that phrase, urban humanitarian operations. But that would be misleading. There is no common statistical definition of what an urban area is. Most countries only use an administrative boundary to define cities. Now, that's not mere semantics, that actually has real-world implications. At the policy level, many of the Sustainable Development Goals have an urban component or a city component. So how we define cities affects what targets we are working for in regards to the Sustainable Development Goals. On the disaster risk reduction side, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction emphasizes disaster governance. Well, if we're emphasizing disaster governance, we need to know who's governing, right? But what if an administrative boundary is smaller than an urban area? And lastly, at the operational level, this has implications. Once you get on the ground and you look at the area you're operating in, you may need to work across jurisdictional boundaries in order to meet populations where they are and to serve them as well as they deserve to be served. Okay. With that in mind, it is tempting to think that the difference between traditional or camp-based humanitarian operations and urban humanitarian operations differs only because of the built environment. Now, I understand why that's tempting to think that way, but let's question that a little bit. On the left-hand side of your screen is an area with a built environment, a population of 99,000 people, 15,000 households, and about in an area of about 1 square mile. On the right-hand side of your screen, there's an area with a built environment with 40,000 people, 25,000 households within 2 square miles. So what can we know? What can we know from looking at these two pictures? Well, on the left-hand side, there's fewer households, but a greater population, so there's more people in the household. Density is a little bit larger because the area is smaller. On the right-hand side, in that picture, we know that households are smaller because there's more of them and a lower population. And we know it's a little bit more spread out because it's 2 square miles. It's pretty, I think you can argue the point that you can't tell which is the camp and which is the urban area. But on the left-hand side, that's the Bentu Protection Civilian Site in South Sudan, where I worked in 2018 and 2019. And on the right-hand side is my hometown of Hoboken, New Jersey in the United States. So I think we can come to a consensus that it's really not the built environment that's the differentiator between traditional camp-based humanitarian operations and urban humanitarian operations. What might it be? Well, one place we can look is these service models. Let's look at how people receive food in camps versus how they receive food in urban areas. Please note, I understand these are grossly simplified models that I'm going to be sharing with you today, but please bear with me. So food distribution in camps. Highly trained logisticians move food from within a region or within a country, sometimes even outside of the region, to areas where that food can be loaded into trucks. And those trucks transport food to camps, and at camps, food is distributed to people. Those people have more than likely been registered by camp authorities, and people working within the camps try very hard to make sure that their operations align with the sphere standards. Food access in urban areas is a little bit different. People go to what I call a food access point. That could be a school if it's a student. Hopefully students are receiving food in schools. If people are a little economically challenged, they can go to a food pantry or a soup kitchen. If they have the means, they can go to a restaurant or a supermarket to purchase food, and then they get food. Those food distribution points are supplied by a food system logistics train that's mainly in the private sector. Also, if people are facing economic hardships, the government can provide cash assistance or vouchers so that they have the ability to purchase food on their own. And then in case of a crisis, those people that I mentioned before, all of those different humanitarians, they provide food to people as well. So just looking at these different models, you can see that the role people play, the people who receive food, is a little bit different, right? In the first model, they're at the end of a system. And in the second case, in urban areas, they're at the center. Now let's explore what that means in real terms. What distinguishes traditional camp-based operations from urban humanitarian operations are three things: the context, the service providers, and the expectations. And these three things together is what requires that humanitarian operations be adapted for urban areas. So in camp, the context, well, the system is essentially the international humanitarian system. In an urban area, cities are dynamic, adaptive systems of systems, economic systems, infrastructure systems, political systems, social systems. All of these things independently are in flux, and all of these things interact, all of these different systems interact in a dynamic way. Service providers. Well, service providers within camps, again, is the international humanitarian system. Everything inside the wire, for the most part, has been brought in by international humanitarians. In urban areas, there's a variety of service providers that we went through in the previous slide. Again, using the example of food service providers range from schools to food pantries, to soup kitchens, to restaurants, to supermarkets, right? And those two elements lead to the third element, which I think is the most important of all these different elements: expectations of residents. In camps, people are prompted to view themselves as beneficiaries. They don't come into camps viewing themselves as beneficiaries, but once they're in, they're prompted to view themselves as beneficiaries. In urban areas, people view themselves primarily as customers, and they demand to be treated as such. Okay. That, I think, is a quintessential difference. As a beneficiary, your role is to accept what is given. As a customer, you have the right to speak to the manager. You have the right to ask for better service. The power relationship is different because since you're paying, you have a greater ability to demand accountability. Let's look at two examples where those dynamics come into play. The first is the case of Zatari. In Zatari, international humanitarians thought that things were going to go pretty smoothly. Zatari is about a mile or an hour by car away from Amman. Early on, when they opened up the camp and established the camp and scaled the camp, they were receiving a sufficient amount of supplies, right? They were approaching standards that they wanted to keep. But despite all this, there were riots, and riots related, at least in part, to food distribution. Criminal elements within the camp had co-opted how people got food inside the camp. And for that and other reasons, people started to riot. So what was the solution? Well, the solution was a market-based solution. They opened up supermarkets, and people received vouchers and could go to the supermarket. Now, this did two different things. One, it brought in effect, the commerce of getting food out of the hands of those people adopting mafia-like tactics into the light by having a market And it also gave people choice and a variety of food, right? And little things like this, in concert with other measures that the camp authorities took, helped improve security and reduce the amount of tension within the camp. So that is a traditional camp setting adopting more market, more urban friendly, I would argue, measures to perform their duties better than they would have otherwise. Now for an urban setting. Following Superstorm Sandy, the Far Rockaways section of Queens, New York was heavily impacted. This is a shot of a residential area in the Far Rockaways in Queens, New York following Hurricane Sandy. Now, we already had urban humanitarians in effect working in the city. That was the American Red Cross of Greater New York. I've worked with these folks off and on for probably decades now. They're wonderfully caring professional folks. But despite their familiarity with the city, their ability to work well in the city, and their professionalism, residents were dissatisfied with the service they received. What did they do? What did the residents themselves do? Well, they started a subsidized social enterprise. They started cooking food that they would take to people who had mobility impairments and couldn't leave their homes. And they gave that food to those people for free, but they also sold that food. And that allowed them to reach people who would not normally be able to get food themselves, either before, during, or after the storm, right? So I think we're seeing here that residents themselves, urban residents themselves, want something other than what the international humanitarian system has been designed to deliver. So if that's the demand signal, you need to change because we want something different. And we're making that demand because we've been trained to view ourselves as customers and consumers and not beneficiaries. How do you meet that demand for change? Well, I think that starts with an orientation change. And I'm going to share a couple of orientation changes that I think are necessary. First, international humanitarians have to stop operating as charities and start operating as social impact actors who help people meet their own needs. We have to stop solely conducting activities per our log frames and also conduct co-designed activities according to situation reports and what the situation needs, and use that mindset to start thinking in terms of hours and days. Urban humanitarian operations is a quicker game. Coordination goes up. We have to stop coordinating bi-weekly or bi-weekly meetings with our clusters. And we have to start operating 24/7 in coordination with other organizations. And that coordination should take place in operation centers. Some people say operation centers are cost prohibitive. I don't mean an operation center that looks like something that you could view on one of my favorite TV shows, Star Trek. I mean a room where people can sit and talk, and they have their computers and you have yours, and they can take notes, and they can do three things. They can coordinate resources, they can share information, they can problem solve, and then they can dictate what needs to get done to the field units that are doing the work. We have to stop recruiting individual volunteers to serve in international NGO design projects, and start coordinating community volunteer groups who are spontaneous, unaffiliated, self-organized, and self-directed. People who view themselves as customers and not beneficiaries will not wait for you to get set up, will not wait for you to optimize your system. They are going to act on their own behalf. When they do so, coordinate with them, link them up, make sure they're meeting international standards. Don't tell them to stop. One, they won't, and two, you're just going to waste time. We need to stop leveraging national NGOs as implementation partners, right? We have to view them as the on-the-ground service providers that were there before, during, and after, and we need to set them up for success so that they can be operationally and financially sustainable going into the future. And we need to understand that they operate in a national disaster management system. We need to stop viewing private sector and businesses as new donors. Yes, they are, but we should also view them as potential operational partners. Global corporations, even regional corporations, they have talented people who want to use their business skills to help others. Let us not leave goodwill and good talent on the table by not integrating those skills into our operations. Lastly, we have to get comfortable moving from an environment where we can somewhat control media access to being comfortable with being uncomfortable by being in the middle of what I call the ambient accountability of mobile communications. Mobile communications is growing quite quickly, and this needn't be smartphones. It can just be people communicating via texts. Word gets around on your failures and your successes. Obviously, rumor control is harder to do when people can communicate so quickly. They will have an impact on your operations in urban areas, and you just have to accept it. You have to lean forward with public information. You have to do more rumor control, and you also have to watch and look and listen so you hear how people are talking about you and how people are talking about what you're doing. Okay. With that change in orientation, what does a different operational model look like? In essence, how can humanitarians support food access in urban areas? Well, first, they need to coordinate, help provide recovery services and funding to all of those other humanitarians that I mentioned earlier on. International humanitarians also should provide cash assistance to people so that they can buy their own food. The Cash Learning Partnerships has wonderful resources on how to do this correctly. They are wonderful. I strongly advise that you look into their free training and all of their documents. Then, international humanitarians also have to coordinate, offer recovery services and possible fundings to the food logistics systems that supply the food access points with food. They have to do the same with those food access points as well. You have to get the schools where where children are fed, the food pantries, the soup kitchens, the restaurants, and the supermarkets back online as quickly as possible. Now, in the event all of that isn't working or it's not working fast enough, then the international system in an urban area should act as the service provider of last resort and feed people directly. But that's not all of the duties that I recommend the international humanitarian community undertake in urban areas. They, again, should also make sure that all of those things being done meet the humanitarian sphere standards. Okay, so let's go over what we discussed. We went over why the rise in urbanization in lesser developed regions requires humanitarians to take urbanization and urban areas seriously. I provided you with my working definition of urban humanitarian operations. We looked at the built environment and how food is received in camp areas versus urban areas. We explored how the system, the service providers, and most importantly, the expectations of residents really is what drives the difference between traditional and camp-based humanitarian operations and urban operations. We explored the case of Zatari and the Shore Soup Project, which I hope was representative of that change in orientation. We looked at the different changes that humanitarians can make when they approach their work in order to work in urban areas. And then we provided a look at what those changes look like when it comes to service delivery. And now I'll stop sharing my screen and take your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rick.